Hi there, and welcome back to National Book Festival Presents, a series that features timely subjects and big ideas brought to you by the Library of Congress. My name is Marie Arana, and I'm the Literary Director of the Library of Congress. Our program today features the distinguished Kemper Professor of American History at Harvard University, Jill Lepore. Among her countless accomplishments, Jill is also a staff writer at The New Yorker and the host of a brand new podcast, The Last Archive. She's won prizes for her work as a professor of history, but she has also won numerous awards for her books, including the international bestseller, These Truths, A History of the United States. Her next book, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future, will be published in September 2020. Speaking to her today about these volatile times and how the coronavirus pandemic will go down in history is my colleague John Haskell, director of the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Jill and John, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to National Book Festival Presents.
Hello, Jill. It's good to have you with us despite the circumstances.
Hey, thanks. It's nice to sort of be here, or be better to be there, but it's nice to be with you.
Some pieces you've written recently help us sort through this new and confusing time, including a fascinating piece in The New Yorker on what you call contagion fables. What do the earlier works in this genre, Mary Shelley's The Last Man, Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, and Jack London's The Scarlet Plague, say that might be relevant to us?
Well, thanks for that question. And just to say again, what a pleasure it is to speak at the National Book Festival and on behalf of the Library of Congress. I This was an assignment, this piece in the New Yorker about plague literature, and I was delighted to have the chance to write it. Partly because I think when we confront a historical problem or something that seems new in history, the first question that historians are generally asked is this unprecedented? And in most cases, the answer is no, it's not unprecedented. There are precedents and we can examine them. And that's the work that historians are generally called to do in a public space in a kind of immediate sense. And I sometimes find that question to be a frustrating one, in the sense that all contemporary developments need to be understood in relationship to past politics. Although that's an important question, we could also understand contemporary dilemmas in relationship to past literary representations. And so I loved about this assignment that the question wasn't, have we ever had a pandemic like this before? How did we respond to this pandemic before? Although those are really important questions. I love that the question was, how have writers dealt with this or imagined this problem in the past? So I got sent, from the magazine, a stack of novels, and then I went and found and read a few more in which writers imagine a kind of end game in which humanity comes to a crisis and possibly dies out due to a global pandemic. And I had actually read before long ago Mary Shelley's 1826 novel, The Last Man. Maybe not long ago, maybe a couple years ago. And it didn't really strike me. Like, I remember finding it kind of boring and just like a weirdness. I couldn't really fathom it. I was writing an essay about Shelley's Frankenstein on the occasion of its 200th anniversary, so 1818. As you know, Shelley was a very young woman when she wrote Frankenstein, the schoolish sort of thriller. She was 16 when she first wrote it. So it's 6 years later that she writes this book, The Last Man, and her life has been upended. All of her friends and her husband have died. 3 of her 4 children have died. She's had 4 children and 3 of them have died. And she writes a novel in which she imagines the end of humanity. And it really is the very first work of literature to picture the end of humanity as a consequence of a global pandemic. And it sets in motion a series of patterns that are actually fascinating to think about. And I suppose when I reread it for the sake of writing this essay, was it maybe the middle of March, maybe even early March. It was very early in the experience of the news of the coronavirus. And I found it very powerful, but I think if I were to reread it now, it would be even more so. So how Shelley what she sets up as a kind of what becomes the trope in literary attempts to imagine a pandemic is that what happens in a pandemic is that we lose our humanity bit by bit by bit, and we are reduced from human beings to mere animals over the course of the spread of a disease and the ravages it leaves behind. And in that way, Shelley's The Last Man is a kind of perfect product of the Enlightenment. Right? The whole theory of the Enlightenment is that humans, rise from the state of an animal, from a state of savagery to a state of the highest moral progress of enlightenment. Right? It's this kind of ladder notion. And in Shelley's understanding of what happens during the pandemic is that we go backwards down the ladder rung by rung.
It's interesting that how you handle thinking about the Shelley book, because a lot of the criticism of the book was that it's autobiographical, which there's an element, as you pointed out, but your take is that it's a lot more than that in terms of what it has to say about our situation today.
Yeah, I mean, and also I wrote an essay. The essay I wrote about Frankenstein is that it is autobiographical. Like Shelley's work just is autobiographical. That's whether that counts as a criticism has to do with how you understand the relationship between autobiography and fiction. But I think that there is something much grander in the story of the. I mean, I don't think it's a great novel, to be honest. It's quite boring. It's like it's fairly deadly. I tried listening to it on tape, and I just kept falling asleep. You got to sit down with this book when you're wide awake with a big cup of coffee. But I think it should be. I think because of her own personal losses, and in some sense because of the grandiosity of her husband, Percy Shelley, she had a kind of grandiose notion of the capacity of humankind, and so then a kind of equally grandiose notion of the descent of humankind.
And you also focus on 20th century novels by Albert Camus and Jose Saramago, and they're examples of plague novels, as you say, as you call it in the essay. Their themes may be even more chilling. What did we take away from them? Do they help us to know things today?
Yeah, I mean, every plague novel really is a parable. I mean, not that there isn't a lot of parable in most modern fiction, but there's a kind of you would find it to be almost a kind of clunkiness. It really takes on the form of a parable or a fable. There's a very strict moral to be taken away from each of these books, and in that sense, I think they're not always the best works of literature because they're so heavy-handed with the way they're trying to deliver this argument. Although both of the examples you just mentioned are actually quite lovely books, and it's the sort of Cliff Notes way to read Camus' *The Plague* is it's about fascism. I mean, the plague is fascism, but it's very elegantly woven together as a story. Though it's Saramago's blindness that I found to be the most beautiful of all of these books, and obviously it has the most modern sensibility. I think it was published in '92.
A little later than that, I think, but yeah, close. I think it's mid '90s, I believe. Yeah,
Yeah, it must have been before he received the Nobel Prize.
it was just
Uh,
before, right?
yeah, and it's just a gorgeous book in which the plague from which we suffer is blindness. Right, this shocking disease that's highly contagious. You just have to be in the proximity of someone um, within hours of being near to them. You lose your sight in a very unusual way. Everything you see is white instead of we imagine blindness to be seeing only blackness. But everything you see is white, and this is a it's a book about a lot of different things, but it is fundamentally both an indictment of our inhumanity to one another and also a celebration of the capacity for endurance and compassion.
But
Uh, I guess it also stuck with me in this deep way because the very last thing I did before quarantining myself, I had a trip to New York that I thought I might cancel, and I ended up going, and I was going to be speaking at Sarah Lawrence College, but also at Rutgers, and my host wanted me to go, so I went, and when I went to speak at Rutgers, it's the last time I had dinner with anybody. We went out to a lovely dinner, maybe 15 people, faculty and students, and over the course of the dinner, this was March 6th, I think, right? Um, I said I had just finished reading Blindness, and pretty much everyone at the table had read it before. It was mainly people from the English department at Rutgers, and so we had this long conversation about it. People sharing the passages that they found most striking, what they remembered best about it. People remembered where they were when they read it, and it was just a kind of communion about literature. About at that moment of not knowing what came next, we all found comfort and solace in our shared experience of this beautiful novel. Uh, so I don't know. This is a precious memory for me. I loved the book, but I also loved sharing a love for the book with this essentially communion table of, of readers.
The Washington Post had an article, I think it was just over the weekend, about a teacher in Minnesota who was assigning, like a lot of high school teachers are doing now, The Plague by Camus. And there was a lot of quotes in there from the students, so a very precocious bunch of students.
Yeah.
But they all seemed to derive positive messages from The Plague, which was interesting. I mean,
Huh.
I was having a little trouble. It was a bit of a stretch for me, but they
Yeah.
stressed that there is this. It seemed to be about how there's a positive side to human nature, and
Okay.
so it wasn't. They didn't want to focus on the plague side.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, good for them. One would hope that they can find that and find within themselves the lightness and the vision to move forward. I don't find the plague to be a celebration of endurance and compassion. Uh, I did find blindness to be that, but that's nice to hear.
Your recent books on U.S. history or the situation today, These Truths, and that was published in 2018, and This America last year, as well as other writings, have focused concern on an illiberal nationalism that has been resurgent, not just in the U.S., of course, in recent years. How do you see the current crisis in this light? Is this the kind of thing that you think feeds the flames of illiberalism?
I think it's far too soon to know what we won't know really until we get to the other side of this what it has done to us and what we have done during it. I don't so I don't mean to dodge the question, but I think you can see forces that go in either direction. On the one hand, there seems to be a lot of interest in some quarters in promoting competition between nations over, as if there's a kind of a zero sum in the availability of personal protective equipment and masks and such, or ventilators, that we have to grasp these things from other countries and make sure that we keep them and don't provide that, or that there's this kind of just very creepy um fisticuffs around resources that fails to understand the global nature of the dilemma. And some countries might be in more crisis at a certain point and then less at another point, but they're going to be in crisis again. Or the, I think, very distressing competition around the race for the virus, for the vaccine. The whole world needs a vaccine, but the idea that the country that develops it will be able to distribute it to its own people first, and therefore will, like, I just the sort of viciousness of that kind of nationalism is really distressing to watch, and to see some part of that is inevitable, but to see it be fanned and inflamed for narrow, short-sighted political ends is very difficult to watch. But on the other hand, I think in no time, and certainly in our lifetimes, have we experienced going through something in tandem with everyone else on the planet. I mean, not it's not exactly a sense of solidarity. I don't think that people, someone in Nebraska necessarily has a sense of what it's like in New Delhi during, that there's different kinds of lockdowns and different restrictions and different resources, and people are living in such widely varying conditions. But the human experience of being confined of having our intimacy with our fellow humans curtailed is a deep, deep, deep emotional and physical experience that we are all sharing in some way. Um, it's sort of like the first act of the disaster movie where the asteroid is about to hit the planet and all the governments decide to cooperate because
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, you might be a different country, but we are all on the same planet. There's so the forces of, I wouldn't say globalism, but some sense of internationalism, some sense of humanism as opposed to the nationalism. There are forces that are in tension with one another right now, and we don't really know um, where we'll come out on the other side.
So as an historian, and you look at what's happening to the economy, and you're not an economist, so it's hard for you to gauge trends any more than sometimes economists can. Uh, do you think that from a political standpoint, we're looking at something that could be similar to what Roosevelt faced when he took office, when the Depression was at its, at rock bottom?
Hmm.
That either Trump or Biden, when one of them takes over, is this sort of an opportunity for the next president, whether it's a reelected president or not?
Well, I think that opportunity has already been proffered, right? We are in that crisis. The unemployment figures and the stock market figure, like we are in that place and in the depth of that crisis now. Um, and I think there has been an extraordinary amount of political action of great worthiness, largely on the part of governors, I would say, and state legislatures. And I would say, on the whole, the striking thing. I mean, the press wants to give a certain amount of attention to the conflict-based stories of people who are calling for the reopening of America, but on the whole, the population, the sort of people have been fairly compliant with the need to take actions to protect the common weal, not just yourself, but the larger community of your neighborhood and your city, your town. So I think there actually has been a lot that has already happened, that edges us out of the political gridlock, the hyperpolarization of recent American history, the last sort of, since 2008, really. I mean, the trends in polarization are different. But it would take a lot of leadership at the national level, um, for economic reforms that could avert a much greater tragedy than what we're experiencing right now.
Hmm.
It would take a lot of leadership at the congressional level. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think, I wouldn't exactly call it an opportunity, um, but there is absolutely a call for a kind of political courage and political will that has largely been absent from the American scene for quite some time.
I think it's interesting you brought up the federal system with the states, which from the founding were meant to take the lead in really some of the central the history of federalism as well, in health and education and transportation and pretty much anything that affects us in a day-to-day life. The states were supposed to take the lead, and that's been superseded by a stronger federal government in the 20th century.
Hmm.
But how do you see that arrangement? That's a 250-year-old arrangement. What you said a minute ago made it sound like you see some positives, that arrangement is not outmoded.
I see some positives, and I think that governors have stepped up and done the work that needs to be done. I think, to be honest, a lot of people probably did not know who their governor was before this crisis. And I don't mean that, in a demeaning sense, but like, how often are you really paying attention to the governor? even in local news, like the news is largely about stuff that happens in the state house. There's not going to be some brutal battle with a vetoing governor or something. But I think people have a sense of the work that governors do and can do, and mayors as well, especially in bigger cities. And I think that's all to the good. I do think, though, in this instance, it's largely a consequence of the failure of the federal government to act in meaningful ways. And in particular, that is to say, not for the failure of the federal government to do anything, but the failure of the federal government to act more quickly than the states, which it should theoretically be able to do, and the failure of the federal government to coordinate efforts across states, which is obviously a necessity of a federal system. So the upside is a lot of governors have really showed up and done their jobs. The downside is that they have had to, because the federal government isn't really working.
And there was a poll that came out just in the last day or two that indicated that the governors who were reaching across the aisle, so to speak, and acting in a more bipartisan fashion were the ones that were dramatically more popular in their states, which plays into some of what you were talking about with regard to maybe the hyperpolarization, at least for the time being, lessening.
Yeah, and I think it's actually very possible for governors to act in a bipartisan way. We think of states as red states and blue states, but all states have all kinds of voters in them. And this is, now is not the time to be emphasizing our partisan differences. So I think there's been some really extraordinary capacity, and that's of course a longstanding trend with regard to the office of the governor. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, one of the things that made Michael Dukakis's political career was the blizzard of 1978. He, it was this terrible blizzard in the state of Massachusetts, and he was on television every night talking about it. And he wore some like goofy sweater, and people didn't really love Michael Dukakis, but they're like, he showed up, he explained what was going on. I mean, he's not FDR with his fireside chat, really feeling what you're experiencing and explaining it especially well. But you didn't really like the guy. Like my family was just really opposed to Dukakis. I had no view, but I remember my dad saying, you got to hand it to the guy. He's out there doing his job. Like there was something about it where like we just kind of put aside, didn't like him, didn't like his politics, didn't like his administration. Well, we're buried beneath 3 feet of snow, and he's trying to help. Like that like that. There's some piece of that where you can kind of set aside your predispositions and think about the larger implications of what a government is for.
Right. So in These Truths, that's the 2019 book, you lay out a role or even a responsibility for scholars in addressing the challenges we face in the U.S. What role do scholars and cultural institutions have in a crisis like we are in now? Are there examples of public intellectuals playing important roles in earlier periods of crisis that might serve as a guide?
Well, the long history of that is a complicated one, and I think it is largely a history that discourages intellectuals from being involved in the public sphere. The sense that there was a big divide between the work you would do as a university professor and a role you might play in public life, that divide was created and then it was taken down in the middle decades of the 20th century. A large number of highly prominent intellectuals engaged significantly in public life, whether they served in the administration of various presidential administrations or whether they had prominent roles in life and letters. I mean, you think about, beginning with like FDR's brain trust, the kind of people that he brought in, or, Kennedy's Harvard men, John F. Kennedy's presidency. Or you think about the 1950s, everyone from William F. Buckley founding the National Review in 1955 and, then founding Firing Line to someone like Arthur Schlesinger serving in the Kennedy administration. There was a lot of that kind of from the 30s through the end of the 60s. But what happened in the aftermath, this is something I actually take up in my book that comes out in the fall, If Then, is that a lot of social scientists, in addition to physical scientists, are really involved in arguing for and defending the war in Vietnam. And they were called out by their academic colleagues who were opposed to that war. And one of the longer term legacies of the Vietnam War was the commitment of many American intellectuals to have no part in public life. That you would essentially be allowing yourself to be conscripted to American foreign policy or the aims of a surveillance state, or that there was really no ethical way to engage as an intellectual in the public sphere, that it was just fraught with so many perils. Among them would be that you'd be promoting American nationalism even without, illiberal nationalism, even without intending it. So after the Vietnam War, there's an incredible retreat of intellectuals from public life, and I think largely for good reason. The academy really closed in on itself. I think it became a very punishing thing to make a choice to engage in public life. I mean, I remember when I was a young assistant professor being told, if you publish an op-ed in the New York Times, you won't get tenure. Like, that was just a rule that everybody should know. If you decided to have an opinion and a voice in public, you couldn't also be a tenured professor. And I think there was a reason for that. There were real costs to that. So do I have a prescription? Do I think an intellectual should do X, Y, and Z? No, but I do, and I do actually think that most of the work that scholars and scientists do, they do in the classroom, they do in their laboratories, they do in libraries, advancing knowledge, producing new knowledge, diffusing knowledge, and that is and of its own of extraordinary value, in the same way that the work that cultural institutions do, acquiring and displaying material, is in its own self, in its own right, an essential contribution. But I do think for some scholars, there can be a sense of a call to act responsibly in public by contributing to public debates. In the same way a museum would decide, this is an exhibit that we should produce a huge K through 12 educational teaching guide to go along with it. Like, this is the thing we really should be bringing to a different public, or this should be a traveling exhibit. Like, the decisions you might make about what we're just going to do here and what maybe could speak to a different audience.
Well, you've managed to be engaged publicly, and Harvard professor. You managed to get tenure in there somewhere, and so there does seem to be a lane now. Or are you the exception that illustrates the rule?
No, I think there is a lane now, and I young scholars ask me all the time, like, what are the rules? Like, can I do this and still get tenure? And I think it really varies from institution to institution. And, I think it's, for me, honestly, it remains a series of very, very hard choices, like things I'm asked to do. Sometimes I think, well, that I shouldn't be doing that. That doesn't seem like a good use of my time. Like, I certainly have to always think about my students first. That's my job. That's my actual, my actual job. I have had an incredibly fortunate experience. I have wonderful colleagues. I have a really supportive university, and I write for the New Yorker, which is a magazine I greatly esteem, and partly because of its commitment to, kind of a big and informed public discourse. Like, I can write an essay, that's thousands of words. That's different from churning out, I don't know, tweeting every day about something, which for me would not feel like a good fit for the contributions I might want to make. So it is a series of choices, and I think it comes down to people's different circumstances. I do think that the consequence with regard to American history is that when American historians, who in particular retreated from public life after the Vietnam War, when American historians who are scholars retreat from public life and don't want to engage in the process of telling the story of the nation's history and confronting its atrocities, while even also chronicling its tremendous achievements and ambitions, then we kind of yield this story of telling the nation's past basically to political partisans, who are most of the people who are doing that work in public, who are not scholars. So I think it's important to fight for that space.
Unfortunately, Jill, we have to wrap up our conversation. Thank you for participating in the National Book Festival Presents series. And of course, we wish you the best.
Thanks so much, John. Lovely to speak with you.